What I'm figuring to do is this. Sunday is Lag Baimer. And Lag Baimer, we celebrate two personalities. One more than another, but we do celebrate two personalities. We celebrate L'Shim B'Yechai, naturally. It's his Stalkus, it's his Yartzeit, and everybody knows the big Zoyar and so forth. That tells about how he passed away, and he told us Talmid to be Simcha and so forth. But it's also a day that's connected to Rabbi Akiva for a variety of reasons, not the least of which that Rabbi Shimon was one of Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim, right? It says in Chazal that Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 Talmidim who died in a very short period of time because there was a deficiency in COVID from one to the next. And then Rabbi Akiva moved to the Dorim, that's the Lashon of the Gemara. And he collected 5 Talmidim, and he re-established Teresh Baal Peh. Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yossi. These were the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. And one of them was Rabbi Shimon B'Yechai. So for these reasons, Lag Baimer has a connection with Rabbi Akiva. So what I did was, I copied from a Sefer. There's a book that I have, it's like an encyclopedia of the biographies of the Tanoim and Maamarei. The people who prepared these encyclopedias, I don't know exactly how holy they were. Insulted. So again, the people who prepared these Sfarim have problems with their emunah in the kedusha of the tzaddikim, but all we're going to do are pisgamim. We're going to read pisgamim, which is Maamarei Chazal Pashat, to discuss Rabbi Akiva's life and the various facets of Rabbi Akiva's life. I don't think that you're about to hear something you haven't heard before, but I think this is a wonderful way in preparation for Lag Baimer to journey through the life of Rabbi Akiva using a handful of Maamarei Chazal statements and episodes in the Gemara and the Midrashim about Rabbi Akiva. You'll notice that I numbered them Aleph through Yud, and then there's Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel, which we either will or will not get to. So on the bottom of the first page, the very, very bottom, you have Aleph, right? And of course, the famous story of Rabbi Akiva, as you know, is Rabbi Akiva would live for 120 years. Rabbi Akiva was a shepherd by Kalba Savua, in time of the second Beis HaMikdash, who lived near Yerushalayim. Kalba Savua was a very, very rich man, very, very well-respected man by the Talmidei Chachamim, by the Romans. And he had a daughter, Rachel. And Rachel was the daughter of this very, very wealthy person. But she had this very, very special and deep appreciation for Torah. And she noticed that Rabbi Akiva, although he was a shepherd and a poor person and unlearned, didn't even know Alabais, she noticed that Rabbi Akiva is unusual in his edelkeit and his fineness of character and so forth. So she proposed to Rabbi Akiva that he should go learn. And she said to Rabbi Akiva, if you will go learn, I'll marry you. Which was so brazen. It was so amazingly disconnected. Here was a girl who was the daughter of the richest person in all Eretz Yisrael, or one of the richest people. And here was a shepherd who was old, he was 40 years old. And she proposed to him that she would marry him if he would go learn Torah. And Rabbi Akiva did it. He was Makadosh and he went to learn Torah. She was a very unusual woman. I mean, tzaddikus is not the word. And of course they had children. Rabbi Shua ben Korcha was their son. Rabbi Akiva was bald. So in the Gemara is something called Kerach. Rabbi Shua ben Korcha, Rabbi Shua the son of the Kerach, the bald one. This is Rabbi Akiva. You don't want to call him Korach because somebody else already has that name, so they had Korcha. Yeah, Rabbi Akiva had children, sure. And it says that he had a daughter who had the same character of his Rebbetzin, her Mesilas Nefesh for Torah. But Rabbi Akiva was not so quick to go learn when Rachel made this proposition to him, because he felt like it was a lost cause. I mean, how can he ever succeed? Until the following episode occurred. This is a medrash at the very, very bottom of the first page. 3 lines from the bottom where I made my Aleph. Pam achas, it happened once. He was standing next to the mouth of a fountain, of a well. He saw a stone that was bored, a hole was bored in the stone from the drip, right? There was water apparently dripping from a higher source to a lower source. And there had been a stone that was there naturally. It may have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years. And the drip had created in the stone a hole, an inverse, an indentation. Miyad don Rabbi Akiva kal v'chemer biyatzmei. So Rabbi Akiva made for himself a kal v'chemer. Though he was 40 years old, he says, imamayim, with water, harachim that are so soft, paslu, as ha'evan ha'kosher, were able to carve, like the word psal, a hard stone. Divrei Teira ha'koshim kebarzel, words of Teira that are hard and tough as iron and steel. Alachas kama v'kama, how much more so, sheyechkeku, that they can carve, es libi, my heart, shubsar, bosar v'dam, which is of the flesh. So the Chazal say, halach hu ubenoi v'yashua etzem malamed tinekes, him and his son went, and they sat in a malamed who taught aleph beis. Achaz Rabbi Akiva b'rei shaluach, ubenei b'rei shaluach, he held one side of the chart, and he held the other side of the chart. Kosav le aleph beis, so the malamed wrote for them the whole alphabet. V'lam that Rabbi Akiva went home and he rehearsed it until he memorized the aleph beis. And then he went to another malamed to teach him something else. All on his own. He was continuing to learn and to go. Ad shalom and kol Torah kula, Rabbi Akiva learned the whole Torah. Now you know and I know that Rabbi Akiva did not have an ordinary neshama. Rabbi Akiva was a very, very special neshama. Naturally, obviously, you don't become Rabbi Akiva. I mean, if you made a list of the 5 most important Jews in Jewish history, starting with Moshe Rabbeinu, 5 most important Jews in the history of the Jewish world, yeah? Rabbi Akiva would be on that list. That's how exclusive, that's how great Rabbi Akiva was. It wasn't just his personal greatness, his contribution to Yidden and to Yiddishkeit is poshet historic. The whole Torah Sheba'al Peh is Talmid Rabbi Akiva. The Zohar, Kabbalah, Pnimis HaTorah is weiter, a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. It's all Rabbi Akiva. One man, until 40 years old, he didn't know Aleph. He was an amazing, amazing personality. But what is so remarkable about his life, and they never used to tell the children this, was how he was so persevering, he was so determined, he was never ashamed, and he never gave up. And he kept on working, and he worked, and he worked. And his desire to have the emes of Torah was so infinite that the Eibush was mezaki him with this chusim that he reached in the Madreges of Limud HaTorah. This is the story of Akiva's Kal V'Chemer. Akiva said, I may be old, and I may be dumb, but if a stone can be bored by water, Torah can penetrate in my mind. And now, of course, we have to go back to the story of his wife, of his Rebbe and Rachel. Go back to the first page, please. And we're going to read several of the Maamarei Chazal that surround his wife, Rachel. The story, of course, was that when her father heard that she had allowed herself to become betrothed, Mukudeshes to Rabbi Akiva, he made a neder that he wouldn't give her a penny, he threw her out of the house. So the Chazal say that it was winter time. Okay? Hadavar haya b'meisach cheref. You see when I made my bays and then I made a 1 next to it? 3 lines above. It's Hadavar haya b'meisach cheref. It was winter time. They couldn't find a place to live except a matbei. Matbei means a silo, a place where you store wheat and grain. So there was hail around her. He was picking the straw out of her hair. He says to his wife, if I had the power, I would make for you Yerushalayim Shel Zav. Yerushalayim Shel Zav was a crown of gold that had what we would call today the skyline of Yerushalayim. Like you have the skyline of Manhattan. And the Gemara, the Mishnah and the Gemara talks about after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, people stopped using Yerushalayim Shel Zav. When a Kala went to her chuppah, she wore this crown. You see, by the Temeneh, by the Yemenites, they still have this custom. But it says in the Mishnah and the Halacha that we don't do it anymore to remember the Churban. But this was before Churban Bayis. So Akiva says to his Rebbe, now I will make for you, if I had the money, I would make for you Yerushalayim Shel Zav. And all she had was the Yerushalayim Shel Tevin. Anyway, the end of the story is that Halach v'Yasher Beis HaMedrash Temes Rishon, his wife had encouraged him, and she went to learn for 12 years. Lifnei, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Yeshua. Of course, the 2 great teachers of Rabbi Akiva were Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes and Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. Each one of them was a story unto himself. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes was like Rabbi Akiva. About Tshuva, he ran away from home, right? Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya was Ashrei Yeladate. Before he was even born, his mother was planning that he's going to be a Talmud Chacham, and as an infant she would bring his cradle into the Beis Medrash, that he should be in an environment of Torah. They were Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So you have a sense. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the Talmud of Hillel. Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Eliezer were Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Rabbi Akiva was one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. In any case, she had permission. She gave him permission to leave home 12 years. Can you imagine a wife who's living in a barn with a little baby? It's just her husband go learn Torah for 12 years and come back. What happened? At the end of the 12 years, Chazal Lebeisa, he comes home. He sees an old man saying to his wife Rachel, how long are you going to be like a widow in the life of your husband? Right? This is called an almana chaya, an aguna they call it, a living widow. Your husband is alive and you're a widow. 12 years she hadn't seen her husband. Says the Chazal, so she says to him, Shma b'koili, listen to me. Lu shama b'koili, had he listened to me, he would sit for 12 years. Think about this, girls. What it means to love Torah. Chibas HaTorah. Here's a Jewish woman. She's not going to learn. She's not becoming the scholar. She's not becoming the Shiva Derav. She loves Torah so much, she's sacrificing her life and the life of her children that her husband should learn Torah. What does Rabbi Akiva do? Rabbi Akiva says Rabbi Akiva to himself, since I was granted permission, I'm going to go back. He doesn't even go in to say hello. He hasn't seen his wife in 12 years. He hears through the window how she says to a neighbor that if he would listen to me, he would study for 12 more years. So he takes this as an indication that this is the right thing to do. And he goes back and he learns for 12 more years. And she waits for him for 12 more years. Shuv halach, so he went again. She sat 12 years in Beis Medrash. B'shuve, after 24 years not seeing his wife, all this time she was so impoverished. The Chazal said that she used to collect the undigested food from the waste of animals. That's how poor she was. He came back with an army, 24,000 talmidim. His wife heard that Rabbi Akiva is coming. Her husband now became the Gadol Ador, the Talmid Chacham, the Rosh Yeshiva, and so forth. Her neighbor said to her, she was wearing rags. But now, by now, at first people thought that she was crazy to stay married to this man. But now Rabbi Akiva's fame had reached such great levels, so her neighbors say, your husband is the greatest Talmid Chacham of the generation. Maybe you should look like a Rebbetzin. Go get some clothes, look like a mensch. And she says, no, I'm fine, just the way I am. Amro lahem, so she says to them, Yedei tzaddik nefesh behem. The tzaddik knows the soul of his behemoth. In other words, we're together. And his Torah and my dress match. And that's how it has to be. So the Chazal, when she reached him, she bowed down to him. So they pushed her away. This bag lady, this homeless woman is coming to harass Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to his Talmidim, Hanichol, leave her. Shali v'shalachem shalahu. What's ours and what's yours is hers. All of our Torah is hers. This has been Rachel, the wife of Rabbi Akiva. This is another episode. Now, if you'll turn the page, the bottom of the first column, it says what happened. What happened? Rabbi Akiva became the Gadol Ador, and his shver, Kalba Savua, now regretted having disowned him. Okay? So if you look at the bottom of the first column, let's say if you had made the 5 and the B and the dash 5, right? So a few lines before that it says, when Rabbi Akiva became famous for his Torah, Toha, Kalba Savua, Chaisne, Al Nidrei, Shehider Esbite Ben Chosav. He regretted, he questioned, he doubted the legitimacy, the credibility, the justice of disowning his daughter. So he went and was Matan Neder. He came to the Chacham and they were Matan Neder. Ahmad v'Nasa Rabbi Akiva machtas heni. Kalbus Avua gave Rabbi Akiva half his wealth. And in one day, Rabbi Akiva and his Rebbetzin became multi-millionaires. Rabbi Akiva became wealthy. He remembered the promise he had made to her a quarter of a century before. He made her Yerushalayim Shemei. He made her a crown of gold with the skyline of Yerushalayim. His students said, how pretentious, how extravagant. A Rosh Yeshiva's wife needs a gold crown like this. You're embarrassing all of us. We can't buy our wives jewelry at all, let alone something so extravagant. Amalahem, so he said to them, Harbe tsar nitzara imi b'teira, that she suffered for my teira, and she deserves it. She has this coming. This is the beginning of Rabbi Akiva's life. How she pushed him, and he went to learn based on this kavachema from the sighting of the stone and so forth. This is the beginning of Rabbi Akiva's life. Now we talk about Rabbi Akiva's teira itself. Now, girls, you have to remember, the times of the Shas, things were not written down. Everything was oral. So there was a very, very different emphasis and priority in how people learned. First of all, you had to remember everything. So all the halachas that you learned, you would repeat and repeat and repeat. It was an enormous amount of memorization. People say, the Gemara says, you learned this in Tanya, Perek Tezvav. People normally repeated things 100 times, over and over and over again. But there was another thing that was very, very different about their learning than our learning. And that is, an unbelievable amount of attention was paid to the Tanakh, to the Teresh B'Ksav, to Mikra, to the Chumash. You go into many yeshivas today, boys learn Gemara and Poskim, and they never open a Tanakh. Because it's not important. You're learning Lamdas, you're learning Mishnah, you're learning Gemara. But then, the whole Teresh Baal Peh was the analysis of the words of the Teresh B'Ksav. And the Gedolei Tanoim, their whole issue was they studied the Tanakh. I mean, to say they knew the Tanakh by heart is an insult. They broke it apart. They cut it up into tiny pieces and put it back together and sieved it and sieved it and sieved it to get out the chokhmah that's written into Hashem's book. Hashem gave us a Sefer Torah. It's a very small Sefer. But in the Sefer you have chokhmah Sefer HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Nobody worked as hard as Rabbi Akiva in analyzing the individual words and letters of the Torah. In other words, Torah Shabal Peh, the whole Mishnah, the whole Gemara, is based on the Mikra. We studied Torah Shabal Peh. The Tanoim and Maamarei analyzed the Mikra. Nobody was so devoted to the analysis of the individual words and letters of Torah Shabal Peh, or Torah Shabal like Rabbi Akiva. And that's why his understanding of Torah Shabal Peh exceeded all the Gedolei Ador. His Torah Shabal Peh was deeper and higher because he was so careful, so committed. There was no such thing as I understand enough in Rabbi Akiva's world. He was obsessed with finding more and more secrets in the Torah Shabal. So let's read a few Maamarei Chazal to this effect that describe, now that we described how Rabbi Akiva became a Talmid Chacham, let's now discuss how Rabbi Akiva learned Torah. So we're doing Gimel. It's the second column, page 728. It says like this. The Chazal tell us that he would listen to his teachers. And you'll soon see a few characteristics of Rabbi Akiva's style of learning, which are truly unique. I mean, the Gemara talks about different ways that people learned. And Rabbi Akiva was very unique for various reasons. He would go and sit by his Rebbes and study and listen to them. Okay? And then, second line from the top, he would go home and he would study it. And he wouldn't just study what his teachers taught him, but he would take what his teachers taught him to the next level, or the next level after that. Aleph zeh lama nichtav. Why is this Aleph written in the Chumash? Beis zeh lama nichtav. Why is this letter Beis written in the Chumash? Dava zeh lama nemar. Why is this word written in the Chumash? V'chazav v'shalom erabeis. Would go back and he asked his teachers, v'amidam b'dvarim, and he gave his teachers new depth, new clarity, new insight into Torah Shabal Peh, into how Torah Shabal Peh analyzes Torah Shabal. I don't have time to give you a long version of this, but today in yeshivas, Bachrim sit and analyze a Mishnah. How come the Mishnah has an extra word? How come Rashi says an extra word? But the Mishnah is a few steps away from the Torah, from Mikra. Mikra's Torah Shabal. Rabbi Akiva was closer to Matan Torah. Rabbi Akiva analyzed the Chumash, word for word and letter for letter. And he showed his Rabbeim and Rebbes, you're not going deep enough. You're not breaking apart the Torah Shabal in enough detail to squeeze out all the Chokhmah that's hidden in there and to find more and deeper and higher and so forth. Rabbi Akiva was the master of the analysis of Torah Shabal. Okay? And on the next page, we read Dalet. Okay, you see how I numbered them. Dalet, it's on page 729. We're going to read another thing about Rabbi Akiva, which is very interesting. There's a Chazal that describes the different ways that the Tanoim and Maamarei learned. Okay, and I'm going to explain it to you in very simple words. You guys go to school, and your teachers teach you things. Now, there's a difference between how we learn, how they learned. Primarily, because the style of learning that existed back then was predominantly halachas. The Rabbeim is teaching them basically what we would call mishnayos. Small little passages of statements, of ideas. There's also the the Talmud, how those halachas were reached by analyzing Torah Shebeksav, but they were taught halachas. And there were different styles of Tanoim. There were Tanoim who didn't know that much. But what they knew clearly. The Chazal say that Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar ben Yankov, was kav and noki. That means to say he didn't teach us a lot of Torah Sheba'al Peh, but what he taught us was pure. And each Tana had his strength. Some Tanoim only pursued one part of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Rabbi Yehuda's Kulat Noi ben Nezikin. Rabbi Yehuda, the great Tana Rabbi Yehuda, was one of the Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, only learned Nezikin. Nezikin is business law. Without Machavere. And some Tanoim had different styles, different approaches. The reason people have different approaches is because it's to do with your mental capacity. If you go to school and your teachers give you too much information, your brain short circuits. You shut down, you get nervous, you get apprehensive, you can't think. You'd rather hear fewer pieces of information and get them straight. Or if your teacher says a lot of things, you'll pay attention to the parts that interest you and just neglect the rest. Rabbi Akiva had an unbelievable, unusual characteristic. He had an ability to take everything as Rabbi said. But he wasn't the only one who had that characteristic. There were other Tanoim, like Eliezer ben Hurkanus. The Mishnah calls him in Pirkei Avos, Beir Suj Edim Abetipa. He had this ability to hear everything his teacher said. But Rabbi Akiva had another ability. And that was, when his teacher spoke, he shut up and he listened. He just took it all in. And then he went home and sorted it all out. In other words, some people who listen to teachers, the organized types, they can't hear too much. The people with the great memories can collect all the facts, but they leave the facts just as the teachers gave them. Rabbi Akiva combined both of these strengths. Let's read what the Chazal say about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi HaYokedel, Rabbi Akiva Eitzer Bolam. You see Dalet? Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the compiler of the Mishnah, who was a spiritual grandson of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's Rebbe was Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir was amongst Talmidei Rabbi Akiva. So he used to call Rabbi Akiva Eitzer Bolam, a treasury that's bolam, that's closed and sealed. And I should look up the Gemara, but the way I understand it is, sometimes people are a treasury of stuff. People have a lot of information and they themselves don't know what they have. Rabbi Akiva on the one hand was a treasury full of information, but at the same time his comprehension of the enormous volume of knowledge in all areas of Torah that he collected in him was so organized and so systemized and so deep. He had it all figured out and put into what's called in English departmentalization. He's put everything in its respective places. So the Chazal continue when they say, Lema, Rabbi Akiva, Daimon. What would you compare Rabbi Akiva to? Lepoyel shenota al kepas kupasav yatsa chutz. A worker goes out into the field with a basket. You find wheat, you put it in the basket. You find barley, put it in the basket. You find kusmin. Kusmin is spelt, you put it in the basket. Pulin is a type of beans, you put it in. Adasha means lentils, you put it in. You come back home, you separate the wheat, goes in one place. The barley goes in another place. Kusman b'fnei atzman, pulin b'fnei atzman, adash b'fnei atzman. Kach also Rabbi Akiva. This is what Rabbi Akiva did. When he listened to his teachers, he had the uncanny ability to listen to whatever his teacher said. His teachers talked about any part of Torah. They never said, Rebbe, I'm not familiar with this, I don't know it, I'm not comfortable with it, you're making me nervous, I'm bored by it, I'm overwhelmed by it. When his teachers taught, Rabbi Akiva just kept quiet and he absorbed, he took it all in. And then he went home and he sorted it all out. That he made kol ha'teira tabos. He organized Torah into rings, into small little subsections. This is Rabbi Akiva's greatness. Rabbi Akiva would then impart this greatness to his Talmidim, and different Talmidim took different areas of Gadlus Seish Rabbi Akiva, but Rabbi Akiva compiled it all. He got it all together. First he collected information, and then he systemized the information. Rabbi Akiva combined a great memory, a great capacity for lots of knowledge, and deep analytical power that's really very unusual. And it's one of Rabbi Akiva's great gifts, was his analysis of words and letters. Nobody was as picky, was as precise in analyzing individual words and letters in Torah Sheba'al Peh like Rabbi Akiva was. And look at number... Hey, okay, look at number hey. This is not that important. Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Tarfon to Rabbi Akiva, a person who separates me is separating from the living, because Rabbi Akiva was a fountain and a source. I wanted to show you a different pisco, okay? And that is on page 732 by the Yud Aleph. I'm not going to read the whole passage. I just want to read you a few words. Okay? That the Chazal tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was in Har Sinai, Hashem showed him the future. And amongst the people, the future was Rabbi Akiva. I'm reading now, you see what I made my Yud Aleph? About 4 lines down, after the Yud Aleph, Maamarei. Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Adam echad yesh, there is one individual, she'asad liyes b'seif kama deiris, who is going to exist in many generations. 732, 5 lines past the Yud Aleph. Akiva ben Yosef Shmoi. His name is going to be Akiva ben Yosef. And as I'm sure you girls know, Akiva ben Yosef was a grandson of Gedim. Yosef's father by this was a Ged Tzedek. She'asid lidreish, who will in the future analyze al kol koitz v'koitz, on each crown of the letters of a Sefer Torah, tilin shel halachas. Mountains and mountains, piles and piles of halachas. Girls, again, long versions, I don't have sufficient time. But I try to give this to you very, very briefly. Torah is Hashem's infinite wisdom. When you say that the Sefer Torah, which is only 305,000 and change letters, is Hashem's infinite wisdom, obviously Hashem is packing a lot of information into these words and letters. The Sefer Torah is a small book. If you buy a Chumash without Rashi or any Mefarshim, it's a tiny little book. You can fit it in your small pocket. Torah is not very large. The infinity of the Torah is the hafachba, the kulaba. Keep analyzing it. The more you examine the words and the letters, the deeper you go into splitting the hairs of the Torah, the more you see the wisdom of the Torah. Torah is like splitting an atom. You separate 2 letters and you have energy. But Torah has different levels. The lowest level of the Torah are the letters, the yossi of Torah. The second level of the Torah, above it, is called the tagim, the crowns of the Torah. The crowns of the Torah are not actually written out, they're just symbolized in the Sefer Torah. The third level of Torah is called the nekudes, the vowels. In the Sefer Torah there's no vowels, right? When you look at the word Omar in the Sefer Torah, you can read it in 100 different ways, because there's no nekudes. We know it's Omar, b'Mesayra, but it can be read Amar, and Emed, and Emed, and so forth. And part of the infinity of Torah is this ability to read the Torah with all different nekudes. And the highest level of Torah is called Taimei Torah. Taimei Torah technically means the trap, the music. But Taimei Torah means the side, the Kabbalah. Rabbi Akiva's expertise extended not just to the yossi of Torah, but to the Tagim and to the Nekudas and to the Taimim. Here the Gemara says Rabbi Akiva would sit and analyze the crowns. The crowns of a Sefer Torah are much smaller than the letters. But for reasons that have to do with the Ruchnias and Gashmias, the less Gashmiistic a part of Torah is, the more light and wisdom there is in it. Rabbi Akiva saw more in the crowns of the Torah than in the words. And he saw even more in the vowels of the Torah than in the crowns. And he saw the most in the timing. In other words, Rabbi Akiva reached the Ein Sof of Torah. We cannot begin to understand how much Rabbi Akiva understood. And the beginning of it was asking questions. Rabbi Akiva wasn't lazy. He analyzed and analyzed and analyzed and analyzed. The Gemara tells a story that there was a Tana who undertook a project to explain every word S in the Chumash. How many times did they say the word S in the Chumash?
You're taking away my lesson next.
Okay, I'm sorry, they said Rabbi Akiva?
Yeah.
Okay, I won't do it.
No, they're not going like that. Fine.
It says, Bereishis bara lakim eis hashmayim ve'eis ha'aretz. Ask you a dumb question. If it said, Bereishis bara lakim hashmayim ve'ha'aretz, who would it bother? The S is extra. S. Yet maybe you have hundreds of S's in the Torah. This fellow named Shimon HaMsaini undertook to analyze every S. Every single S. Kabed S avicha, ve'es imecha, right? Es Hashem alekacha tira, right? What's the lashon of the pasuk? You have to know what the S means. Each S has to be nidrash. So there was a fellow who was Dairish Essen, and he got into trouble. It came to Es Hashem al-Gachatiri, he backed off. Rabbi Akiva came along and finished the job. He wasn't afraid. This type of analysis, we learned the Shas, we learned the Rishonim and the Medrashim. And if we really are interested, we could find Taka the Medrashim of these S's, and these hundreds of S's in the Chumash. But this was the kind of thing Rabbi Akiva was obsessed with. Words, letters, crowns, nekudas, everything. He studied. It starts with the question. It starts with not knowing and wanting to know. And then the Eibishter helped Rabbi Akiva. He was Machadash Chedushim. He created Teresh Balpeh, Nigle, Halacha, and also say it, Kabbalah. Rabbi Akiva's Talmud is a Pshim Yochai. Think about it. Let's continue now.
Was he the kind of person that was born great?
But there's no question.
That's what I'm
We
saying.
can't. It says in Hasidus, you saw the Maamarei, that in the time of the Tanoim, the Elokus was more big Galus, and anybody could have become great. Could go in Rabbi Akiva, understand? The world was an eight-letter world, so the Chatchila, in other words, everybody had Halak in the Shabbat. If you wasted it, it was wasted. If you exploited it, you become Rabbi Akiva. In other words, the mashmos is that anybody could have become Rabbi Akiva. And then, but it was under the Shemesh, it was under the Zeit. But a Yid, 40 years old, to knit the Shemesh, again, Len Alabay, Babalam Adadik, together with his son. It's Peladik. Let's do Vav now. So girls, we just explored two areas of Akiva's life. Number one, his pursuance of Torah. And number two, his analysis of Torah. And of course, number three is his delving into the secrets of the Torah. That everybody knows about, the famous Gemara Masechet Chagiga. That Rabbi Akiva, who hayachid, top of page 729, number Vav. Who hayachid mi'arbas ha'chachamim she'nichnesu lepardes she'yatzu b'sholem. He's the one, he was the only one of the four Chacham who went into the secrets of Torah, came out b'shalom in peace. Again, this is a inyan which is discussed at great length in the Rebbe Siches and in the Maamarei and so forth. The Gemara says that there is something called Davar Katan and Davar Gadol. There's a small Torah and a large Torah. What's Davar Katan? What's considered the small Torah? Havayas Abaye v'Rava. The deep intellectual labors of Abaye and Rav in analyzing halacha to Teresh Balpeh, that's called Davar Katan, small things. And Davar Gadol, what's considered great, Ma'aseh Bereishis and Ma'aseh Merkava, the secrets of how Hashem created the world, and on a higher level still, the secrets of the Eibishter's throne. And the Gemara says about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe, that Leiniach Davar Gadol Davar Katan. He didn't overlook Davar Gadol, Davar Katan. In fact, the Gemara, my Davar Gadol, Davar Katan, and the Gemara says Davar Katan, Havayis Abaye v'Rava, and Davar Gadol is Ma'aseh Bereishis. And Rabbi Akiva explored Pnimis HaTorah. But you have to understand, if you're going to start exploring Seidas HaTorah, and you have a holy, sensitive neshama, you have to be careful. So the Gemara says that there were Arba Shenichnesu Lepardes, that you know about, 4 who entered into the gardens of the secrets of the Torah. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, Rabbi Shimon ben Zema, and Elisha ben Avuya. And there was only one difference between Rabbi Akiva and the other 3. Mastama, you guys are teenagers in America, so you're very, very politically astute, right? Old people forgot about politics, but you guys know everything that's happening in the papers. So one of the most familiar terms in politics today is called exit strategy. Rabbi Akiva had an exit strategy. When Rabbi Akiva went into the Pardes, when he started to study secrets of Torah, the Gemara says, Nichnas b'shalom v'yotza b'shalom. Translates the Rebbe in the Sichas. Rabbi Akiva knew the sakon of learning Seidas HaTorah. Before he went in, he made for himself a plan that he shouldn't forget that Leilateu Baral Hasheves Yitzhara, Hashem wants us to live in this world, not to run away from this world and end up in Ein Sof and in Atzilus. So though he was dabbling, he was exploring, he was delving into the Seidas HaTorah, he did it in a protected way that he should come back to doing mitzvahs maisis. The other 3, you mentioned it, one of the girls mentioned it, that the Shimon ben Azai, Hitzis Umeit, he passed away. And Shimon ben Azai, by the way, was Rabbi Akiva's son-in-law. You know that, right? Ben Azai married Rabbi Akiva's daughter. And it's very interesting that she was supposed to die the day of their wedding. Right? The famous story with the serpent. With the needle, with the pin, because she did stuck it. The bottom line is they were never married, really. Right after the wedding, Ben Azai says, Nafshi Choshko B'Teira, I changed my mind. I don't want to be married. I want to sit and learn Torah all the time, even though it's a mitzvah say that I sit to have children. So somebody said to Ben Azai, the Eibishter wants a world. So he says, the world can be similar. They Mamish were never married. They had a chuppah of a kedushin, and he immediately gave her a get. And the interesting thing is that if not for the fact that she had given tzedakah, he wouldn't have had to give her a get. In other words, the Eibishter's plan was that Ben Azai should be the chassan of Rabbi Akiva's daughter, and they should never live together as man and wife. But the original plan was that she would die the day of their wedding, and Ben Azai would be Nafshi Choshka B'Teira. In the end, because of her tzidkis, Ben Azai had to exercise a bchira and to say, and the halacha is that if you're a tzaddik like Ben Azai, that you don't have to get married. But only if you're a tzaddik like Benazir. Otherwise, you're mechuyev to get married and be married. Even an old person is not supposed to live without a isha. They state in Gemara. Supposed to be married. Benazir was a very unusual man, but he passed away young. And then Shimon ben Zayma was nifka. The Gemara says he lost his mind. And Elisha Acher became an apokedis. And this was what was unique about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva's discipline. Rabbi Akiva also loved Chasidis. He loved Kabbalah. He loved the light of the Torah. But the discipline was a ne'er l'raglav, the bittul, the Kabbalah sale. You have to do what Hashem wants, not what feels good. Not even what feels good in Yiddishkeit. Made Rabbi Akiva the great man that he was. This is about Rabbi Akiva's dabbling in the Seder Sateh, which is another whole dimension of Rabbi Akiva, which we know very little about. The only thing we know about Rabbi Akiva's knowledge of Kabbalah, about the Gemara Masechet Chagiga, has quotes Rabbi Akiva's statements of Kabbalah. Rav Shimon bar Yochai was his Talmud. You don't need more than that. Rav Shimon bar Yochai, the father of Kabbalah, the creator of the Zohar, and so forth, was the Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva used to say to Shimon bar Yochai, Dayach, Shani, Ubeirach, Makir, and Kehecha, be happy that I and the Eibishter, Rabbi Akiva said, be happy that I and the Eibishter know how great you are. In other words, nobody else can understand the greatness of Shimon bar Yochai. But Rabbi Akiva says, but I do. And then there's another Maamarei Chazal, which Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai said, Shanu midoisai. Shamidoisai trumes, the trume is the midas Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai said, learn my midas. And Rashi says in the Gemara, in Masechta Gittin, that this means learn my way of learning Torah. Because my derech of learning Torah is the best of the best of the derech of Rabbi Akiva. This is Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva, in addition to his Mesiras Nefesh for Torah, and his depth in Torah, was also deeply involved in Seder Sateh, which is a very strong connection to Mashiach. Which leads us to the fourth point. Rabbi Akiva presided, he was a Rebbe of a Klal Yisrael in a very difficult time. You know, one of the Maamarei Chazal that's missing in this pamphlet is the famous Gemara. The famous Gemara, the end of Masechta Makis. Right? You all learned Makis, Mr. Yeah, you made a Siyam Makis. With the facts. That he was walking with his two friends. And they saw the great city of Rome. And then they came to the place of the Beis HaMikdash. And they saw a fox running through what used to be the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Now you have to understand. Rabbi Akiva was in the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Akiva was Ani Agevaro Oni. He was alive when the Beis HaMikdash stood and he watched it burn, if not literally then figuratively. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the leader of Klal Yisrael was his Rebbe's Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the Rebbe of Rabbi Yeshua. But nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva lived 120 years. He was killed approximately 70 years after the Churban. So when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Rabbi Akiva was a 50-year-old man. He wasn't a boy. And he witnessed the Churban HaBayis. So for him it was a real thing. And by the Churban HaBayis there was a Holocaust. The Rebbe once told a survivor once told the Rebbe in Yechidus that there was never such a genocide of Jews like the Holocaust. And the Rebbe said, Bayesheni given Eri. The Rebbe said, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was worse than the Holocaust. If you learn the Gemara in Masechet Gittin Kipshutei, it's a Guzman, it mentioned billions of Jews were killed. But our Philip said Guzman. The Rebbe said more Jews were killed when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed than in Bayesheni, than in the Holocaust. It's a lot of Jews. And Rabbi Akiva witnessed this. And his friends are crying, and Rabbi Akiva laughed. What are you laughing about? There's nothing funny about it. So he said, just like these prophecies of the Eibishter were fulfilled, for sure the good prophecies, the Oz version Oz, will sit. Canaan was a Canis, Bechutz is Yerushalayim, and so forth, that the Eibishter will bring Mashiach. Rabbi Akiva tzachikoch the Mashiach. Rabbi Akiva, he looked at the Churban, at the Tzaras, and he anticipated the coming of Mashiach. This was Rabbi Akiva. And finally, you had the Maismut Bar Kochva, that the Yidden, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. And the Yidden remained in Eretz Yisrael, many of them did. And there was, of course, the yeshiva in Yavne, which the Babylonians, with the Romans left alone, as the Gemara says. And the king who ruled during that period, about 70 years after the Churban, was extremely, extremely cruel to the Jews. I think it's Nidoin, but I could be wrong. I forgot what name of the case it was. Adrianus, right, Adrianus' case. He was a Rosh HaMerush, he was an Achsar. And he was so cruel to the Jews, he made Felcha Gezeres. They couldn't learn Torah, they couldn't do anything. His Gezeres was so terrible that he forced the Jews to rebel. They had no choice. He plots. If you're a dictator, you squeeze people, but you don't want to squeeze too tight, because you want the people to accept your brutality. If you become overly brutal, you have nothing to lose. And Bar Kochva rebelled. And the credit goes to Hadrian. This is how they honest. He was so evil. It was pashut impossible. And Rabbi Akiva was the Gadol Hador during that period. And of course, there were two parts to Rabbi Akiva's contribution to the history as it unfolded. Ubahagdama, I want you girls to understand something. This happened around 70 years after the Churban Abayis. And remember, the second Beis HaMikdash was built 70 years after the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Based on Psukim and Tanakh, based on Nevi'im. There were many Jews who believed that 70 years after the Churban, Mashiach comes, the Mikdash is rebuilt. So there were two pieces of Rabbi Akiva's contribution to Hadrian, to Adrianus' Rishis, and what happened to Rabbi Akiva. The first is his support of Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiva decided that it's time for Mashiach to come, and he supported Bar Kokhba's rebellion. Right, it's in Rambam, yes. But it's also in the Gemara. So we're going to do now Zayin, which is on page 730. Okay? So Rabbi Akiva said, Bar Kokhba's name, they called him Bar Kuziva, but his name is Bar Kokhba, right? Bar Kokhba means star. So Rabbi Akiva said at Emes, that it says in the Chumash, see how I made my little asterisk, a little bit below the Zayin. Dara Kokhba miyankiv, hat Rabbi Akiva gesagt, this goes on Bar Kokhba. And the Gemara said, the Rambam says that he was Minese Kelev Shabar Kuziva HaMelech. He became a Meshamish Bar Kokhba. He supported Bar Kokhba's rebellion. Now, Bar Kokhba was a tough guy. He was a powerful leader. And you should know, he beat the Jews into shape. He was a tough warrior. He created a very powerful Abachlal. If you know the history, the Jews were great warriors. The Jews in time of Chaldo, in time of Bayesheni, including in time of Chanukah, they weren't Nebuchs, they were tough warriors. The unusual characteristic of Chanukah was that it was the Koyanim who were fighting wars. But they were very, very tough fighters, very, very loyal. They fought like lions. Bar Kokhba whipped them into shape, and he made them all behave, and people got out of line. Bar Kokhba was a very tough ruler. I have a relative who happens to be a historian. They have documents Bar Kokhba wrote, where he's telling his generals that they don't listen to him, he's going to chop their fingers off. He was a tough leader, and he led the Jews in rebellion against Adrianus. But there's one thing you shouldn't forget about Bar Kokhba. Very important detail. Bar Kokhba was a Shemesh Shabbos and a Eichel Kosher. He was a Frum Yid. He kept Tayag Mitzvahs. And although the Chazal, the Gedei Yisrael, and Maamarei were bottled to him, he was the king and they were just the rabbis. He was okay. But he was a Frum Yid who fought and respected and honored and lived for Torah. This is why the Rambam holds Bar Kokhba could be Mashiach. The Rambam holds that Rabbi Akiva wasn't wrong. The whole machlokes is, did Rabbi Akiva make a mistake in saying that Bar Kuziva HaMelech was a Mashiach or not? So the Raiva says Rabbi Akiva was wrong. He miscalculated. He paskin wrong. The Rambam says no. Bar Kokhba had the halacha qualifications for Mashiach. Because according to the Rambam, to be Mashiach, you don't have to perform miracles. To be Mashiach, you don't have to be a big tzaddik. To be Mashiach, you have to be a Fruma Yid who fights for Yiddishkeit. That's it. And Bar Kokhba was a Fruma Yid who fought for Yiddishkeit because the Rambam's Mashiach, this is something that the girls have to learn and they look at the Sikhs, revolves around Torah. It's all about Shleimus HaTorah. The whole Mashiach is Yiddishkeit. It's not about meeting your bubby and your elder bubby and having your favorite candy and not gaining weight. Mashiach's about Torah. And Bar Kokhba, who was not a tzaddik, he was a general, he was a Frum Yid, and he listened to the Chazal, and he was loyal to the Chazal. Rambam doesn't say he was a bad man. Rambam says, Meis Ba'avodah, he died because of his sins. So we know that he was Malchi Yisrael HaKsher, he was a good Jewish king, but Mashiach he isn't. But halachically, the Rambam holds that the Akiva was correct in assessing Bar Kokhba as Mashiach, because the model of Mashiach of Rabbi Akiva, which is the model of Mashiach of Rambam, is that Mashiach's inyan is to fight for Jews and Judaism. When they started the Jewish state, people were screaming that this is Rahman al-Islam, Eschalta de Geula. And the Rebbe said, how could it be Eschalta de Geula? How can it be Mashiach? The whole inyan of Mashiach is the Shulchan Aruch, is Torah. Here you have Jews who don't believe in the Eibishter, whose whole role is to destroy Yiddishkeit, and that you're calling the beginning of Geula. Bar Kokhba could have been Mashiach, not because he was a tzaddik, not because he had nevuah, not because he could fly, not because he was a Mason, because he was a Frum Yid who fought for Yiddishkeit and he had a chance to succeed. And that's what Rabbi Akiva held that he was Mashiach. And of course, the rest of the story, girls, is of course the famous story of Rabbi Akiva giving his life for Torah. The end was Rabbi Akiva died al Kiddush Hashem. Sorry?
There's
You're right. He was one of the Asad Lugi Maluch. If you can go to the bottom of page 730, we're doing Ches now. Okay, the Papas Ben Yehuda said to Akiva. Right. Well, he had a little help with the Kalais HaNefesh over there. The Kalais HaNefesh was a little bit...
He used the opportunity instead of being murdered, he got it.
It sounds so easy when you say it. When I say it, it doesn't sound so easy. I don't know why. Okay. Papas Ben Yehuda says, Akiva, not afraid of the government. Rabbi Akiva, this is the famous Gemara. Rabbi Akiva answers him with a mashal. What does this compare to? A fox is walking on the bank of a river. Dogim, he sees fish. That are collecting, herding, right? They're schooling, they're shoaling, and they're dashing around. Have you ever seen a fish that's not nervous? Every fish is nervous, because all the fish is nerves. Fishes are not very sophisticated animals. Omar says, the fox and the fish, what are you dashing around for? Omar said, the answer, it's because of the nets. The other people are bringing upon us to capture us. Omar says the fox to the fish, oh, you're afraid of the nets? No problem. If you so desire, come up onto the dry land. V'nadur and Ivatem will live together. Like foxes live in what's called layers, underground holes, and maybe they're a little dark and moist to be very comfortable for the fish. Like my parents live with your parents. I don't know what that means. So the fish said to the fox, Atahu, are you that one? That you're the wisest of all the animals? You're no wise man. You're a fool. This is the place where we can live. Anu, Nisyarim, we're afraid. In a place of certain death, you want to give us safety and security. Allah has come overcome. Says Rabbi Akiva to Papas Ben Yehuda. Us also, at this moment, on a Yoshev Eiskim Ateda, we sit and learn Teda. Shekosov, that's written in the Abish's Heilig Teda. Kehu Chayecha ve'erach Yamecha. Teda gives us life and long days. Kach, we're risking our lives to study Teda. If we don't learn Teda, we're going to die for sure. Allah has come and become. Omar says the Gemara, a short time passed. Actually, Tafsul Rabbi Akiva was captured. They put him into jail. And they tried him as a criminal of the state for doing what? For learning Teda. And the Chazal say that his Talmidim used to come and learn with him. And they had great Mesiras Nefesh. They saw that Rebbe being Mesiras Nefesh Teda, they followed suit. And then the Gemara tells a tragic story. This is a story that happened in the Holocaust 1,000 times. Tess. Ma'aseh Rabbi Akiva, Shayachal, Beis Asur. Happened Rabbi Akiva was in jail. Why Rabbi Yeshua Agarsi Mishatzer? Rabbi Yeshua Agarsi was his servant. Every day they brought him a certain amount of water. And part of the water he used to wash his hands, and part of the water he used to drink. One day, Mata Hashemer, Beis Asurim, the guard finds him bringing in this normal ration of water. He says to Rabbi Akiva, it's too much water in that barrel. Maybe you're using the water to moisten the earth so you can excavate your way out of jail. He spilled out half the water. He gave Rabbi Akiva half a ration. So then Rabbi Yeshua Agarsi brings the remaining water to Rabbi Akiva. He tells Rabbi Akiva what this Rosh Marusha, what this Hitler did. Amalei says Rabbi Akiva, tenli mayim, give me the water. She'etel yodi, so I can wash negalvasa. This is what happened with the Rebbe's father, you should know. He had a cup of water, used it for negalvasa and didn't drink it. Rabbi Akiva did the same thing. Amalei. So Rabbi Yeshua Agarsi says to him, there's not enough water for you to drink and keep your body and soul together. And you're going to wash your hands? Amalei says, Rabbi Akiva to Rabbi Yeshua Agarsi, what am I to do? You don't wash negalvasa, it's even hipachachayim, Rachmana litzlan. Mutav almost, misas atzmi. I'd rather die in my own hands, not to violate the instructions of the Chazal, that you cannot touch, you can't do anything without negalvasa. Amalei says, the Gemara says, Leitam klum, he didn't eat anything, they brought him the water, not the other way to wash his hands. Let's go to Rabbi Akiva. And finally, Yud says the Gemara, what you mentioned to me before, Bisha'a sheitziu es Rabbi Akiva la'ariga, when they carried him out to murder him. And they killed him on Shekes al-Barzel. They killed him, they skinned him, Nachman al-Islam. It was time of Shema. While Yusekin is beside Masrekes al-Barzel, they were Nachman al-Islam skinning him. They were peeling the skin off his body. And there was no anesthesia. And he was accepting upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. The Eibush is his melech. And in Tzachasiris it says Rabbi Akiva was dying b'teich tainuk because he wanted to die. Maamarei Talmidim says Talmidim told Rabbeinu Ad Kan. This is the extent of your suffering. The Rabbi Akiva, who was the greatest Tana of all, the whole Teresh Balpeh that we have today is because of Rabbi Akiva. He was Mois Nefesh for Teirah, Mois Nefesh, and the Eibush is murdering him, and he's saying Shema. Omar Lahem says he to them, Kol Yomai Yisim Mitzvah Al Pasuk Zeh. All my life I was wondering, I was having pain. It's one of the mitzvahs in the Torah that you're supposed to love Hashem with your whole nefesh, with your whole soul. What does B'chol Nafshecha mean? Afilu Neidlas Nafshecha. Even if it's going to take your life. Amarti Rabbi Akiva says, I used to say, Mosa Yovel Yodav HaKayamena. When is this opportunity of Mesiras Nefesh Al Kiddush Hashem? Rabbi Akiva says, I was waiting my whole life. No one's allowed to be a martyr. You can't make yourself into a martyr. I was wishing and praying and hoping that Rabbi Akiva, that the Eibush would give me this chus to be Mesiras Nefesh Al Kiddush Hashem. Now I have it. I'm not going to do it. The Gemara says that he was elaborate in Echad, and his neshama was Yetzer Bechad. I think the Gemara says about Rabbi Akiva. Gufach tahar, when the Shmascha tahar b'chol min etara. Maybe I'm misquoting, but Rabbi Akiva, when he died, the Chazal, Rabbi Akiva. Anyway, das ist unsere Ruchnis de Kezedes. Und der Fahr seine Mir Juden. Okay, good night and a happy Lag BaOmer.